On September 13th, 1992, the hit Nicktoon Doug began airing its second season, along with its fellow classic Nicktoons counterpart, Rugrats. Both shows, along with Ren and Stimpy a year earlier, had redefined what television animation could be, actually being more creator-driven and not just appealing to kids, but also trying to reach wider audiences, in a way animated shows just weren't really doing prior in the West. Case in point, Batman the Animated Series released a little over a week prior to the season starting to air, which very likely would have existed regardless of the first 3 Nicktoons coming out, but its release and success really showed that this truly was a new era for animation. One where truly incredible shows can come out that could be considered all-time greats then and still hold up today as being some of the all-time best, even if they are animated kid shows. And while I can't prove this, I wonder if the success of stuff like The Simpsons and the first 3 Nicktoons really emboldened that show's creators to take risks and do things no animated show prior really had done before. Being a darker and not comedic action series at all in a way that was not similar to any animated action show that had come out in the last decade, while also having complex themes and characters. And yes, while I won't shock most people by saying Doug really isn't that kind of show that is still praised today for being one of the best, it was absolutely part of this wave, definitely strengthening this movement. And something like the second season actually tackling new topics kids, tweens, and even younger teens can relate to, and it evolving as a show is a great showcase of something in this era that would not have happened previously for the most part, and something shows that would be released later and around the same time would expand on. There's not any serious continuity, and I'd be lying if I said Season 2 was that much different from Season 1, but it does try to expand on this world and the characters within, and move the show forward in a unique way while telling different, more interesting stories with Doug. Because of this, the show continued its popularity and would get 2 more seasons after on Nickelodeon, and a few more on Disney, continuing to lead this new era with its fellow first 3 Nicktoons for the time being. So, what do I think of the second season of Doug, and how does it hold up? Well, it's definitely interesting. Doug Season 2 is a weird one, because all the same problems I had with Season 1 still remain, at least to some extent. And while there are definitely things this season does better than the first, and I would overall say I liked it more, it's still a bad season, pretty comparable to the first season overall as far as quality is concerned. I think the reason this season at least feels like a step up is because it is definitely more polished, despite the pacing and tone of the show still not being the best and letting a lot of episodes down. And it still has a very hard time balancing topics that could relate to more older kids and tweens while having elements that make it feel like a show aimed at really young kids, like the simpler stories, art style, and tone. That all is still definitely improved here, making episodes overall at least a little more engaging to watch and easier to get into and understand what an episode is going for, at the very least. And because I meant what I said, the show does definitely try to evolve, which is very respectable and does make the season better. They really took an effort to put these characters in new and unique situations that could tap into experiences older kids through younger teens have, and even to address more complex topics kids may confront as they grow up. And I feel like as the season tries to strike more ambitious topics and stories around this, I think they end up actually succeeding covering ideas like this a lot more often. Another thing that's definitely better here is there's a lot less of Doug just being insecure about something stories, even if the execution and exploration of a lot of these really good ideas are spotty at best. I also feel like there's a bit more of an effort to define our main characters. Doug is a sheltered kid in a small traditionalist town, and all the other characters are shaped by that setting as well. but in the first season, I don't think they get much out of this element, or really even take stock of it that much. As I said, Doug is just insecure about minor things a lot of the time, partially because he is sheltered, but it's just not that compelling and there's just not a lot of depth there. And the other characters don't benefit off of this interesting context either, which could make their characters honestly a little complex if they actually played into how this small traditionalist community really shelters some of these kids and kind of holds them back from doing things they want to do. But in actuality, the show just kind of portrays them as really simple. In this season, however, there is definitely a more active effort to play more into how this community really shapes these characters, and more interesting acknowledgements of how this community operates in a traditionalist way. It's not amazing, and they don't go super far with this, but it is definitely better, and some of the best things of the season come out of this, which I hope the show continues to mess around with. Also, there were more episodes of at least some type of quality here, even if there wasn't anything that great. And there are less bottom of the barrel episodes here, even if there's still a pretty similar number of bad episodes to season 1. And I do think overall the worst episodes of this season are better than season 1's worst episodes, and the same can be said for the season's best episodes being better as well. This is all around a better season when I lay everything out. So, why do I think this season is still very similar in quality to season 1? Well, because even though it has its improvements, they're all very minor overall, and the show still suffers from being very slow-paced and really uneventful a lot of the time, and even when it has a good, maybe even great idea, a lot of the stories and characters are still just so cookie-cutter. They continue to go with the most simple or generic route when telling some of these stories, and the characters, well being expanded on, some of them are barely more developed here than they were in the first season, and a lot of the time still read as pretty bland. Same thing with the world itself. This all might have been a big step forward for the show at the time, and some of the things covered might have been unique and creative, but comparing it to anything remotely similar, even stuff it inspired, it still is just so lacking in comparison. That point I made in my season 1 video very much has not changed from watching this video. And I know it's kind of unfair to judge it like that, because of the great legacy Doug does leave behind, inspiring a lot of those shows, or having at least some influence over aspects of them. But that's just how it feels to watch this season as an adult in 2026. Yeah, maybe at the time this was a big step up, but because I'm watching it now, it does lead me to appreciate how the show does a better job tapping into things young people could relate to, while at the same time honestly making me more annoyed by the fact that those elements are still undermined by bad stories and tone issues that continue to undercut these great ideas. Either way, these are things today I would expect to be much better by the second season of a show. And maybe that's also unfair, and it did lead me to feel like maybe I was being a little too harsh on some episodes I would have given more of a pass in season 1. But that's just how I ended up feeling at the end of the day. With all this in mind, this season, while being more polished, definitely still has some stinkers that embody the worst elements this season and show have to offer. But there are still some highlights that show off some of the season's improvements and best elements. So let's get into discussing the worst and best episodes of Doug Season 2. Starting with So as I said, there were less truly bottom-of-the-barrel episodes this season, which led to there being really only 3 episodes I truly debated getting the worst episode spot. But there were 3 other episodes that were reasonably close. So before we look at what did take the worst episode of the season title, here are 5 runners-up. Doug Meets Fentruck was never in super serious contention for the worst of the season title, but it is definitely one of the worst, and I wanted to bring it up because it is a perfect showcase of everything that's wrong with this season. The idea of having a new kid in school who came from another country is an interesting one, especially seeing how he adjusts to the new environment and how kids react to him, which could be really fun. There is so much you could do with this concept, showing him overcoming issues, especially in the world of Doug, with this being a small town that feels very closed off from anything else. But they really don't do anything with this. Fentruck isn't really bothered or has strong opinions on anything, and the whole episode just follows Doug's boring perspective, reacting to things that happen to Fentruck, and then looks at his conflicting feelings involving him believing Fentruck has a crush on Patty, who he also likes. This could also serve as a really interesting element in the episode. Sometimes tweens have crushes, and because they're too young to really be that interested in dating, or to actually date in any serious way, they're just content in having a crush on someone and not acting on it. But through complications like this, Doug has to actually confront whether he is ready to act on his crush or not, or if he should just let Fentruck go for it because Doug just isn't ready for a relationship yet, and what the implications of actually pursuing Patty are. This is actually so interesting and could connect to kids in this age range, exploring the feelings of romantic affection for the first time as kids watching are going through that, and the feeling of being pressured to maybe act on those feelings for external reasons. But the episode has nothing to say on any of this either. It's just Doug being kinda nervous in a not super specific or in-depth way, and then he tells Fentruck how he feels, and it doesn't even lead to a tough or interesting conversation because, oh wow, it was just a misunderstanding, which is so predictable. So Doug doesn't actually need to confront anything, and this plot goes nowhere. This episode has some really good ideas, but its story is so painfully simple and cookie cutter that none of the good ideas really shine through. Outside of one or two decent moments where they do get a little out of this episode's premises, either one of them, it just doesn't really matter because either way, this is a terrible episode. But the next few are just worse overall. So this season has a few episodes that follow exclusively the adventures of Doug's comic book character, Quailman, while only following Doug in the real world a little bit. And Doug Battles the Rulmeister is one of them. And I get what these episodes are going for. Showing off a comic book story written by a kid that has parallels to his own life based off people he knows, not caring how good the story is, really trying to tap into a child's imagination, and honestly, very limited scope of comic books he reads or is even allowed to read, is fun and can connect with kids in a cool way, who also make their own comic books and insert their own characters that are very similar to themselves like this. And while the first episode of this whole idea this season isn't that good, but also isn't terrible, this one just sucks. Look, I get what it is trying to go for, but the episode just isn't that creative. They don't do a ton with Quailman's adventure. The first episode, despite my problems with it, had a different setting and characters with different designs. Well, this one mostly takes place in Bluffington with normal characters besides Quailman and the Rulmeister. And if this episode isn't going to be that creative, then it could at least stand to have a fun story, even if it was a cliched one. But the story is so simple and straightforward. There's no real surprises, and the episode is very slow and repetitive. Once again, I get what they were going for, but if this episode is going to be so boring and not creative in the slightest, then what even is the point of making it? This isn't the worst episode of the season, because there are a couple of cute and funny moments, and also because this is not the worst Quailman episode of this season. So, this is an interesting one, because watching this season for the first time, this was easily my least favorite episode. I thought this was a nothing of a story that was just a repetitive series of events that doesn't mean anything because you get a dumb twist ending. And while I stand by that to an extent, I will say watching it again, I do at least get what this episode was going for. When you're a picky eater around that age, it is easy to feel like if you're put in a situation where you have to eat something you don't like, that it will be embarrassing or will even lead to bad things. Like Doug in this case, being nervous that he is gonna throw up if he eats liver. And while all that could be relatable, the problem is this episode is the closest this season gets to one of the really bad Doug's insecure about something plots from season 1. And while I think this one is definitely better than the worst of those episodes, this also just doesn't end up tapping into anything because it all really just amounts to Doug getting really worked up in a way that feels super overblown and is hard to take seriously, or even see a kid connecting with it because it makes this idea and fear feel like a joke, and then it's just him trying to eat something over and over again until he finally does. But shocker, they were never gonna eat liver, which Doug probably should have expected. That part isn't a problem with the episode, just a side comment. But either way, the twist is predictable. Anyways, there's just nothing to this episode, and it's just so devoid of any substance, and once again, very predictable. You know Doug is going to be able to eat this eventually, and that it probably won't even matter to the dinner party, so it makes these really simple, repetitive parts of the episode even worse and feel even more pointless. Not the worst idea ever, but absolute horrible execution. But this episode isn't aggressively dull, and is at least semi-easy to get through, despite not having anything I like in it, unlike the next 3 episodes, which were more frustrating. Man, so this episode, Doug's a genius, I really did consider for that worst episode mantra, because on rewatch, I was kind of dumbfounded how little there actually was to this episode, and how little it has to say on a pretty interesting topic, while simultaneously pretending it does have something to say. So the topic of why some art is considered to be this insane masterpiece, seemingly on superficial things, while other art that seemingly looks really good and has a lot of meaning behind it gets ignored, is an incredibly interesting topic and a controversial one that people have many thoughts on. And seeing Doug get caught in the middle of these different ideas after he gets recognition for a painting he really didn't make, but came about by an accident involving his dog, could be really good. The episode could have a lot to say on how different people view art, artistry, and art criticism. But this episode has nothing to say on any of this. But it goes beyond even that, with the episode kind of pretending to have something to say with its message that is actually so devoid of substance, which is just really infuriating and kind of treats the audience like they're dumb. This episode is just Doug getting praised for the said piece of art that came about in that weird way I mentioned, but nobody knows that but him. One of the main issues with this episode is that these people have really no reason to praise Doug. Everyone just says his art is great and he uses great technique, which the episode doesn't expand on what anyone means by that. And while I can see some of these people being kind of fake art critics, quote unquote, with not in-depth reasoning to like a piece of art, I cannot see Judy's friends doing this. Even if their reasons are dumb, they would still be in-depth, hell, maybe even overthought reasons for why they like this art. But no, they just say it's great over and over again and say it's better than other artists, which is very weird for friends of Judy who go to this art school. I understand that these friends can be stuck up, but stuff like this and the other characters having no real reason to like this art just serves as a forced way to make this plot make any sort of sense. And that's the bigger problem with this whole chunk of the episode. Another issue is that Doug has no opinion on any of this. Why the art is being praised, and if there's any validity to that, or if it's really even right for him to use this art he really didn't have much, or if any, involvement in making for personal gain. No, he's just kinda nervous about the art not being his. That's basically it. What makes both of these things really bad, though, is because this episode is framed like it has something interesting to say about art being praised for seemingly superficial reasons that the people praising it don't actually understand, but they don't say anything, and you really see this through the ending, which really singes it for me and makes this episode one of the season's worst. Having a message about meaning over style, when the artist in question who is judging the art and says this message apparently is known for his strong use of style, which is all the characters who do mention him seem to talk about. Also, this message is a load of nothing on top of that. Like that phrase, meaning over style, doesn't actually mean anything. The episode wants to make fun of people who focus too much on style over anything else, but don't know why people are like that in the first place, or why meaning is better than style, or what that really even means, because how do people convey meaning? They do it through style. And this comes back to all the people in this episode just loving Doug's art for seemingly no reason. Even though other than Judy's friends, I get those other people's reasonings being not super well thought out and following popular opinion on art and art criticism, but they don't really define what that idea they're mimicking even is. Even if their reasons are gonna be simple about what they're following, you'd at least need to show the current popular way artists and art critics look at art that the masses would follow, and what kind of art style they're specifically speaking to and praising, to give a reason to show why people would blindly follow this ideal of how to judge art and why they don't really have any opinions of their own if you're gonna make a critique about how people do judge art. You really need to do this if you're gonna make the argument at the end of this episode that praising style over substance is bad, because as an audience member, I don't even understand what style they even think they're praising. They would think this way because an artist made a compelling argument either through their opinions or actual art about a type of style and were influenced by him, but no, they just praise Doug's style for literally no reason, saying it's similar to a certain artist and that he would like Doug's painting, or that Doug is even better than him, without exploring what that style is or how it's similar to any other artists. The episode just gives the audience this cookie cutter message after not defining anything it's talking about, which makes this episode so bad. This episode doesn't even need to be that complex. It just needs to have something actually meaningful to say. Have the characters get obsessed with this art because one particular stylistic element people point out, people really love because that element is currently popular in the art sphere. And then have the message show that one stylistic element doesn't make a good painting if there isn't actually any meaning behind it. That's an actual message and story that could at least say something about art and art criticism and the art sphere, even if you don't agree with it. The fact that you maybe don't agree with it would make it more complex and more interesting. And the episode could have actually told a good story and used it to say something, but as it stands, this episode says nothing while tackling a really rich topic that it could have had a gold mine of stuff to say about. Such a waste. And the only reason this isn't the worst episode of the season is because the next two try even less and do something even less unique and interesting somehow. So, remember that Rulmeister episode I didn't like? Well, imagine that episode again, but worse. Yeah, this is Quailman facing off against a vice principal bone-themed villain who puts ridiculous restrictions on people. Except it's less interesting because it all just takes place at the school. They don't even use other locations. It's even more repetitive, and there really isn't even any cute or clever moments or twists that could have made this episode even remotely exciting. I really have nothing more to say. This episode is just so slow and repetitive and rips off an episode that wasn't even good to begin with and I've already talked about. I really debated giving it the worst episode title on that point alone, but once again, I do understand what this episode and the previous Quillman episode I talked about are trying to showcase. They're trying to demonstrate what it's like being a kid coming up with their own stories and tap into that experience kids can relate to. And well, at the same time, I still don't think that's worth making an episode about if it's gonna be this crappy, and they already did this idea to zero effect. I can at least understand why this episode was made. If they thought that previous one worked, why not go at it again? I wish it was more original and I wish it was better, but I at least get it. Which I can't say for the actual worst of the season, and that is... After how bad the last couple episodes were, why is this the worst episode? Well, there is not a single episode this season that is more bland and gives less of a justification to exist than this one. For every other episode, I can kinda see what the creators were going for, and maybe some of that passion for the idea shines through in the end product. But with this one, there's just nothing. It doesn't have much of a story, but the problem goes beyond that because all this episode is this kid being mean to Roger. That's really it, up until the end. It's just Mr. Bones' nephew, Percy, being a relentless bully and harasser to Roger, which could be kinda satisfying, seeing Roger get a taste of his own medicine. And maybe it is the first time it happens, but I don't know. Roger is a particularly confusing character in the series, because they want him to be Doug's big bully, but also want him to be sort of a member of Doug's friend group, which could be an interesting dynamic, and one that is true to life. There are a lot of kids who, because they have to spend so much time with their grade in grade school, that even though a kid is really mean to them a lot of the time, they still kind of end up in similar cliques. But the problem is they don't really do much with this, nor do they do a great job really defining Roger, even in this season when they're a bit better about that with all the characters. Some episodes, he is truly terrible, and it seems like no one likes him or are friends with him at all because he's just such a relentless harasser and bully. And in others, he's just kind of annoying, but people enjoy having him around. His character is just so flexible, which could also be fine, but it just leads to me not really having an opinion on him because they don't really do any of that well. He doesn't really feel like a character who's slightly flexible from episode to episode so they can get interesting stories out of him. He just feels like a character they kind of characterize whichever way they want, depending on a plot they want to tell. He can sometimes serve as a decent antagonist, but when they try to give us a different look at him, I don't care because there's just such a weird disconnect from how he's portrayed in different episodes, making him hard to get invested in. So in this episode, early on before Doug gets involved in the story, I'm not really sure if this is Roger getting a taste of his own medicine or if Roger never really did anything bad enough to deserve this. The episode is making the argument that Percy is going way overboard, and while Roger is getting a bit of a taste of his own medicine, he has never done anything this bad to personally deserve how far and how long this treatment goes on for, which is partially true because obviously Percy is horrible and no one deserves this treatment, but Roger can be really awful and relentless in some episodes. So is Percy really worse? Other than not having his nicer moments, which doesn't change how awful Roger's actions are the rest of the time, I don't really think so. But at the same time, episodes portray him so differently that I don't really know. You're starting to see what the problem is? And maybe this episode could have gotten away with portraying Roger as not the worst bully ever to make the point that Percy is definitely worse. But at the same time, they show us flashbacks to other episodes, meaning the episode kind of wants you to take those other episodes into account when judging Roger's behavior, which makes the whole deal of analyzing Roger and who he actually is and how bad he actually is really weird. This episode's just a mess. So this episode just ends up being a character I have no attachment to, getting horribly harassed throughout most of the episode, which even if I don't care, just isn't fun to watch. And even if it wasn't fun to watch, it's just boring and repetitive. Eventually, Doug does get involved in the story, but it also isn't engaging, because Doug really has no stake in it at all, or really any reason to care about Roger. I think Doug is a nice enough guy that he would care about anyone getting treated this way, but for the story, I think that's a weak reason to get him involved in the plot. Doug and Roger aren't really friends in the show in any meaningful way, so as an audience member, when Doug starts feeling bad, I just still don't really care. It would be interesting if Doug had more conflicting feelings on the whole subject, but his change of heart to thinking Roger is getting a taste of his own medicine, to feeling like this is all going way too far, is really straightforward and not compelling in the slightest. I don't care about Doug's role in the story, because he doesn't have a strong dynamic with Roger outside of this episode, and all Roger really is to him is just his generic bully who is occasionally nice. And also, Doug just isn't really involved in the story until the episode really needs him to be. If Doug was more compassionate throughout the entire thing, maybe I'd get more invested in his role and maybe that would work, but because they give Doug a really straightforward cookie cutter story about him slowly warming up for feeling bad for Roger, but he's not really in a decent portion of the episode, it all just doesn't work. It's all just done to give us this dumb finale. So, all of a sudden, Doug has to fight this bully after not really being a serious part of the story, as I said, and then Roger bails him out by telling Mr. Bone, which is so predictable, but also a really lame and nonsensical ending. Roger is super afraid all episode to tell Bone what is wrong because Percy is related to Mr. Bone, and he doesn't think Mr. Bone will believe him and think that he's causing trouble because it's Roger, so he doesn't tell him out of fear of not being believed, but then is randomly able to easily tell him. I do slightly understand that it is because Percy gave him a time and place he was going to kick Doug's butt, so Roger could set him up, so Mr. Bone could clearly see he was doing something wrong. But at the same time, why would Mr. Bone all of a sudden believe Roger? Even if Roger came in and told him that, he would still probably brush him off for the same reason that Roger assumed he would the rest of the episode. So why would Roger all of a sudden think Mr. Bone would believe him in this situation? You can make up excuses for this, but you shouldn't have to, because it's just a lazy twist that really doesn't make any sense as presented in the episode, giving us this dumb ending. So yeah, this episode is a repetitive, boring, and unpleasant mess that isn't fun to watch, and it's the only episode this season I just can't even get what they were even going for, because I know that they wanted to say something more complex about Roger's character, but they don't say anything, and I can't imagine where they would even believe they're starting to say something. Roger is the exact same character as he started. His relationship with Doug hasn't changed at all. Just because he bailed Doug out because Doug helped him, that feels like something Roger would do in most episodes, just based on how they portray him in other places. And they can't even say, oh, well, Doug is lucky to have Roger and not someone like Percy in his life, because one, you should never be happy with the bully you have. Bullying is wrong, and you should not have to deal with it one way or another. But also, once again, in some episodes, Roger is pretty darn bad. So I once again don't even know if he looks better than Percy by comparison, especially in some of his worst episodes. And they want to show Roger has his good side, but we know this. We know this from other examples we have seen. Simply put, who cares? On a side note, Percy is really bland, especially in his appearance here, and just the way he talks. He's just a generic bully plot device who really left no impression on me the first time I watched this episode, and even now, I would not be surprised if I forgot everything about him by the time this video came out. Nothing is even close to being funny or charming in this one, and overall, it's just a nothing of an episode, and easily the season's least redeemable and worst. So, despite there still being a lot of bad episodes this season, and not many good ones, there were still a few episodes that did shine brighter than their contemporaries, even more so than in Season 1. in terms of there being more standout episodes, and them being overall better than the best of Season 1. I should still say, none of them are great, and there's still only one or two I would consider to be outright good, but despite the show's problems, it can produce an episode here and there that does really tap into something that older kids and even some younger teens can connect to. And I do want to give it props for that, especially since it can lead to some cool and interesting results. Are these the best episodes ever? No, definitely not. And I don't know if I'd return to most of them past making this video, but they definitely deserve to be praised for what they accomplished at the time. I have 3 runners-up I want to discuss first before getting into the actual best episode. This was one I really liked a lot watching it for the first time, and expected it would be in serious contention for the best episode spot. But after rewatching it, it's honestly not that fantastic. But I still think this episode is on the higher end of okay, and really does have something to offer, and additionally is better than most episodes in Season 2. I really do like how this episode looks at procrastination, and how easy it is at that age to get consumed by something like a cool new video game, even when you have priorities that you really need to get done, like homework assignments, especially when you really don't want to do them, and have this easy excuse to keep pushing all that off. I appreciate this episode for similar reasons I like procrastination from SpongeBob, because this is a topic anyone who has had to do an assignment for school and just doesn't want to do it or wants to do something else can relate to. And while this episode isn't in the same ballpark as that one, I do like the direction this one goes in, showing less the inability of getting something done because you're just looking for anything else because you can't focus, but instead shows how hard it can be to put a brand new cool video game down or something else addictive like that in a ton of depth, which is pretty interesting and really captures that relatable experience effectively, and how especially hard that can be at a young age when you're first starting to get your real sense of freedom, like being allowed to stay up late and play video games on the weekends. I also really like the ending a lot here, where Doug gets lucky that he lost track of time so much he actually still has a day left to go when he thought he blew through his whole weekend, but at the same time, it shows him that it could have gone the other way, and he can never get distracted like this again when he has a big assignment like this. I thought that twist was really clever, and I really didn't see it coming the first time. I thought Doug would actually get punished, and he would have to learn the lesson that way, and he would probably end up weaseling his way out of it. It's just a fun twist and a good message. The downside to this episode is, while this episode does a great job representing this relatable concept and has good messaging, it's also very repetitive and still pretty simple. A lot of the episode is just Doug being distracted, or playing this game, or fantasizing about something related to the game. There's just not a ton of variety here, even within how these things are shown off. And while the episode is still okay as is, it would have been a lot better, or maybe more seriously competed for the best episode spot if it was a little funnier, or there was just more variety in how they show Doug's addiction / his procrastination. But as it stands, this is still an interesting little episode I enjoyed watching the few times I did. This is another episode I think is flawed enough to only be on the higher end of okay. But I think this is one of the few episodes of the show that really plays into how closed off this town can be really effectively. There's a lot of places that have traditions that most people probably aren't in love with, but don't question it because it's just the way we do things here. And it can be hard to push back against even minor traditions, especially in really small, closed off, often conservative areas. So I do really like and appreciate that this episode shows that it's okay to make changes to town traditions, especially in a case like this with the retelling of a story that probably is not totally accurate anyways. There's no reason why these kids putting on this Founders Day show can't do something different with it, and showing that creative expression in general through the arts can be a good thing. which can also be looked down upon in areas like this, where they're just seen as something to meet specific purposes, or actively looked down upon, or seen as unbecoming, or something not worth investing any time into because it doesn't serve an immediate purpose. I do think the messaging in this episode is really good, and honestly lovely for this reason, and that is an element that really shines through here. What holds it back is that this episode takes a bit too long to get going and plays out rather simply. While a story about Doug and Judy butting heads working on a show together could have been interesting and fun in its own right, that's not what the episode is about. So the mislead is really unnecessary. And in execution, while the message is great, and I love the showcase of that through this performance, which is so cool, especially with how cringy it is, honestly, I think that makes it more effective. The episode, in practice, is still kids wanting to put on a show, the adults say no, kids kinda do it anyways, and then the adults are fine with it. There's really not much pushback of any sort, or any sort of back and forth, which would have made the actual story more engaging and less dull in execution, and allowed them to expand on these ideas instead of literally just showing using the arts to change traditions and creative expression for kids is good actually, in a very straightforward way. But this is still definitely one of the stronger episodes of the season, worth a mention here for just how overall solid and how commendable the messaging is here. This episode was actually pretty close to being the best episode of the season, and one I think is actually outright good, even if it's nothing that fantastic. The episode just has such a classic comedy story of a lie Doug tells backfiring on him, leading him to being forced to keep up this lie in increasingly ridiculous ways, with him going to this dance. Especially thanks to the involvement of Judy. Judy is a weird character where honestly, while I liked the idea of her being this really outgoing drama kid in this very uptight traditional town, it always felt like they never played into that in a very interesting and specific way, and just wrote her to be this weird off-the-wall character with no real consistency to how she is weird or what kind of weirdness she actually displays, and also to be used whenever the show needed her, however the show needed her. But in this season, I think they not only write her in a bit more of a consistent manner, being a stuck-up drama kid, always looking for an opportunity to prove how talented she is through acting and dramatics, while subverting expectations of people around her because she enjoys it. She just enjoys the grand nature and fun dramatics of it all. But at the same time, they play around a lot more with her role in the town and within the show itself, through her trying to subvert norms and people's expectations, and it made me really start to get her character and actually start to like her. She is by far the most interesting character in the show, and this is definitely the best use of her all season. This story is just so fun. Doug gets put into a ridiculous situation, but honestly still an understandable one because of how it's all set up. You easily understand why Doug makes the decisions he does in getting here, even if they were dumb decisions and short-sighted. And this leads to an engaging story because I actually like Doug and am invested in him dealing with this problem and keeping up this act, and I'm also interested in seeing where this fun plot goes. This also leads to a lot of good scenes and jokes, especially because of Judy. She adds such a fun wrinkle to this episode and makes the stakes of it all much more interesting, because it doesn't come down to just if Doug can hold up this lie, but also can Judy hold it up as well through this fake character she is playing and refuses to play in a super conventional way that won't risk her getting revealed, which leads to the fear of if she will go over the top enough that it will lead to something happening that reveals her, or if she will just decide to reveal herself on her own terms because she also enjoys messing with Doug and him kind of being at her mercy, as many siblings would. The tension in this one is just really fun all around and different from other episodes. And it especially picks up when the characters get to the dance in the second half, where they just have so much fun with this concept and the weird tension involved. But I think what inevitably holds this one back is just that, well, it's got a lot of great elements, they don't do enough with any of them. The episode still is way too reserved for how fun this idea is, and parts of it still play out rather simply, when this one could have been truly a blast if they went further with different scenes, utilizing these main ideas and just going crazier with the concept, not being so reserved like other Doug episodes. But no, the episode plays out in a pretty straightforward way, and this leads to this episode taking a little bit of time to get going, with the first half definitely being weaker than the second, where, as I pointed out, this episode picks up a lot when we get there. I think mainly a decent chunk of this episode is just Doug being nervous, and while he is likable and I care about him here, just him worrying and his daydreams aren't that compelling and eat up a bit of time. Also, the ending reveal is lame. For all the ways Judy could have been revealed, they picked the dumbest, most out-of-nowhere one when they could have had a really fun, crazy reveal. And while I like the actual ending to the episode and think it's cute, I also think they could have done something more fun or interesting. Regardless, this is still a solid episode and a clear highlight from Season 2. But there is one episode that is better, and that episode is... So, when I first watched Doug's Secret Admirer, I knew it was very likely gonna be the best episode of the season. Because while Doug's a Big Fat Liar has a great premise that actually manages to make you care about Doug while doing a lot with that premise, this is the only episode all season that actually really taps into ideas kids to young teens can really connect with super effectively. Those ideas being what it's like to be a kid dealing with feelings of romance for the first time, and what it feels like to face the idea of affection from another person when you're not used to experiences like this, demonstrating how complicated these feelings and experiences can be at that age. This episode actually manages to tackle more complicated feelings and emotions young people experience while using them to set up quite a few interesting and funny scenes. The experience of being a kid who thinks someone has a crush on them for the first time is an experience many kids go through, and I love how Doug demonstrates this in a fun and interesting way. Doug's internal monologues and fantasies here are actually fun and really work to get into Doug's head to show how exciting this experience can be for a kid, but also some of the complicated feelings that come with it. This might be exciting. Someone feels affection for me around the time I start to develop romantic interests, but am I ready for that kind of attention? What if it's someone I'm not into? Do I have to act on this? And what if it's not the person that I'm into? What if it's not my crush? These are a lot of different questions and ideas the episode confronts, and obviously there's a lot of easy answers to these questions, but to a kid, these new ideas feel big. And while Doug doesn't go super far exploring any of them, even just lightly touching on them through this story and tapping into them in a way kids could really connect with is good. It's what I wish the show was able to accomplish more often, and is so much more compelling and has more depth to it, at least a little bit, than most episodes in this show. And they do just showcase so much fun stuff with this idea, from seeing Doug initially get excited about the idea of someone having a crush on him, and theorizing which girl could have the crush on him, to thinking it's Patty and deciding to make a move, but not knowing exactly how he wants to do that, and then it not working out for strange reasons, demonstrating feelings of rejection at that age and how weird and devastating they are when your emotions are big and developing and you're really starting to experience feelings of romance and more romance-oriented situations for the first time at that age in a pretty compelling and true-to-life way, which is another thing I really think kids could connect with, only to throw the audience and Doug for a loop by revealing BB is the one putting these notes in Doug's locker. And then the episode shows Doug conflicting feelings on how he feels about a girl having a crush on him that on some level he thinks is cool and sophisticated, I would say, and feels kind of flattered she would like him, but also thinks is stuck up and isn't actually really friends with it all, nor has actual feelings like that for her. And this leads to some wacky antics of him trying to get her to lose interest, which leads to some funny moments and an ending where Doug actually levels with BB, who doesn't actually interact with him a ton in the show, and we get a really good ending and message that's a little more complicated for this series. That just because you don't feel the same way about someone doesn't mean you should treat them badly or act oblivious to their feelings, and should actually just be respectful and honest with them, which Doug kinda learns earlier in the episode when the shoe is on the other foot in a bit of a different way. Because Patty doesn't know how Doug feels, but he still feels bad about her not acknowledging his feelings when he thinks she would, which leads him to realize BB, who has told Doug her feelings, probably feels even worse because she does put herself out there and gets the cold shoulder. This is actually a more nuanced and subtle way to go about giving a message to kids, and the message itself, which I think is a valuable one for kids to learn, so they can grow up being conscious of others' feelings and save themselves worse, more complicated situations, while also growing up to just be more respectful human beings. All this leads to Doug putting what he learns into practice, being honest with BB, which leads him to realizing this was all a misunderstanding, which works out well for him because obviously he's not into her, but through being honest, he actually learns a bit more about her and grows a little closer with a girl he didn't have the highest opinion of or closest relationship with prior, which makes the conclusion feel all the more meaningful, I think. That despite situations, exploring ideas of crushes and romance at that age being awkward, even if they don't lead to you having a romantic relationship, especially at Doug's age where kids probably shouldn't be dating anyways, they can still lead to something positive. And through respectfully being honest with someone about not feeling romantically interested in them the same way they feel towards you, it doesn't have to close the door on you being friends, which is another idea I could see kids getting in their head. Even though I do wish we got to see a bit more of BB after this, and maybe BB and Doug engaging more, or even BB being more interested in her actual crush, but you know, the show is episodic, and I still think the ending works. And I won't spoil who her real crush is, but yeah, it is pretty obvious. And that twist of her having a different crush and this all being a misunderstanding could ruin some of the messaging, but I think it honestly doesn't undercut any of the points I brought up, and does serve to add an additional wrinkle to how weird and awkward these experiences of dealing with romantic ideas as a kid are. That BB couldn't just come out and tell the person she liked how she felt, so she had to pass these notes around to set herself up, which kicked off Doug having his whole conflict and exploration of his own feelings, when none of that would have happened if she would have just been confident enough to tell her crush outright. So yeah, this episode is just all around good. It successfully tackles a distinct experience kids can relate to, and has an actually interesting plot with many fun scenes, which really utilize the concept well, and even has some meaningful messaging leading to a sweet ending. All while using the fantasy scenes and more lax pacing to actually serve the episode and not hurt it, allowing you to really feel how Doug is processing everything and understand his headspace in a situation that feels more complicated to him, allowing you to really breathe with the character, which I think was always the point of this show, but isn't utilized very well, but it definitely is here. The fantasies might be silly, but they really nail Doug's feelings on these weird situations, and it is fascinating, at least for a watch through or two. And look, I'd be lying if I said this episode was great. It's still too slow, and this episode is still too simple in pockets. They definitely could have gone much further exploring these ideas in different scenes, and the utilization of the fantasies can come off as a little clunky in execution, even if they thematically fit and they do show off more about how Doug is feeling. I think the episode could have been better served to actually explore some of Doug's feelings in a bit more of an in-depth way, and instead we get these fantasy sequences that are still pretty silly and do kind of break up the episode weirdly, even if I still think they work in context of the episode. But it still ends up kind of making the pacing of this one still feel a little off. And all this does hold the episode back from being anything great. But it is definitely a good episode at the end of the day, and one I was glad to spend a lot of time talking up because it definitely deserves it. And it's easily Season 2's best episode. And with all that said, the video is done. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more content similar to this in the future. Also, leave me a comment down below telling me what you thought of my video and my thoughts on the episodes I discussed. Do you think I nailed the best and worst episodes of this season, or do you think I should have picked other episodes if you've seen the season before? And what do you think about Doug's Season 2 in general? Am I still too hard on the show, or have I been pretty spot on so far? Also, comment if Season 3 will finally be the season of this show I outright enjoy and will be more positive on. Spoiler, probably not, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. And hopefully it won't take me 2 years to release that Season 3 video. But with all that said, I have more videos coming soon and a lot of fun plans, so keep watching my community tab for more updates on upcoming projects. And until next time, this has been Chocolate Guy, signing off.